Hi everyone, I hope you are all doing well. Looking forward to touching base on our module for our Gifted and Talented Learners class. Last week you had your first discussion board post due, so I wanted to start with reviewing that case study and discussing how we all did on our discussion boards. So, as I've mentioned previously, each of these case studies is actually a real example of something either I have experienced or a colleague or a friend. So I do that very purposely because I want you to have practice with some real world experiences that you are likely to encounter related to gifted education. In this case study, we have Mr. Taylor, and this is a common problem. He is put in this space where he needs to advocate for the importance of gifted services. So, as you remember, there's a policy in his school that says that ninth graders are not able to take AP courses. And Mr. Taylor is arguing that it would actually be very beneficial for students to take these AP courses as a form of gifted and talented services. So, a couple of things to start off here. First off, there are a lot of ways to define giftedness. That's something that you should have recognized pretty quickly in your readings for this week. But generally, we define giftedness as above average potential, academic potential, when compared to your same age peers. My personal favorite definition of giftedness is Renzulli's three-ring model, where we have above average academic ability, above average creativity, and above average task commitment coming together. A lot of times we make the false assumption that giftedness just means you're really smart. And that is simply not true. Hopefully you've noticed that there's a lot more to this construct of giftedness than just advanced academic ability. That is one of the main things that we consider when we look at the difference between gifted learners and learners who are potentially high achievers. So it's very important not to say that gifted students are just smart students. In fact, gifted students, yes, they may be academically more advanced, but my favorite way to describe this is that gifted students not only maybe learn faster, but they learn differently. And that different word, to me, is the most important word for us to remember as we advocate for these students. Because if they learn differently, then we should most likely be teaching them differently. So we really have to carry that throughout. So a couple of things that I wanted to mention for your discussion board posts. I do like to go through and read a couple of samples that you guys gave in your discussion boards, mainly because these are your words and I'm not taking credit for them, and also to promote more of a sense of discussion here. So a couple of things that you wrote. Alex mentioned that giftedness is comprised of a variety of factors. So we have children and adolescents that can exhibit different gifts at different stages of life. So I think this is an important note that she mentioned. It seems that the principal in this case study has a very one-size-fits-all definition of giftedness, and it's important to recognize that giftedness can look different for different students. So you notice in some of these definitions that students can demonstrate giftedness in multiple areas. So you may be identified as gifted in English or as gifted in mathematics. You also notice other definitions included things like leadership ability, artistic talent, and creativity as well. So it's important that we don't assume that all gifted students are the same. It is very likely that we have in a gifted class a very heterogeneous group of learners. Some may be gifted in one area and not the other. So I was happy to see that comment in terms of giftedness looking different. And that is definitely important to stress in this situation for the principal. He needs to see that just because the student scored highly does not mean that they're all the same. Juliana did a good job mentioning that gifted students learn differently and therefore they need differentiated services. Ashley also pointed to the truth that not all gifted students are the same. And she also advocated the importance of providing services not only to challenge students, but also to ensure that they are given an environment to develop more gifts and talents. So when we get further in our studies this semester, we'll look at what I call the invisible gifted. There are a lot of issues of underrepresentation in gifted education, and a lot of that is due to the fact that we have very different environments where we grow up. And sometimes students may come to school and they may not seem gifted, but that's really because they haven't had the same educational opportunities to demonstrate those gifts and talents as some other students may have had. So it's important that we don't think that giftedness is stagnant, but rather that we know that it's changing and developing over time. Amanda did a great job emphasizing that giftedness does not simply mean high test scores. In fact, it goes beyond those high test scores. I really appreciated Dustin's practical suggestion to give the principal a copy of that myths handout because it's important that you realize that even your administrators may not have any formal training in the sense of gifted and talented education. Zoe did a good job emphasizing that we should not be trusting one source in terms of a test score, but rather we should be looking for evidence of giftedness across multiple different measurements and characteristics, which we'll look at in a couple of weeks. So basically, let's walk through this. Now you've heard from some of your fellow classmates. In Mr. Taylor's situation, there's definitely a problem going on, right? So we have students that would benefit from these AP classes, and the administrator is saying, no, we just don't need to let them do that quite yet. We need them to wait for another year. Now, the reason the principal thinks this is okay is he's quoting the fact that most of these students are at the 95th percentile on a standardized test score, which clearly is a good score, right? If you're in the 95th percentile, that means you scored the same or better than 95% of the students. So it's almost like saying you're in the top 5%, which is definitely impressive. But one point to make, and one of you mentioned this, I'm sorry I don't remember who, it's great if students are doing well, but we need to look at that pattern over time. Is it 95th percentile, 95th, 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 and really that could be stagnant? Or are we seeing a constant growth for our students, which is really what we want as teachers? Another thing to be careful of when we are looking at test scores, we have this concept called the ceiling effect. And basically what that means is there is a situation where students know way more than the test can show. So when we come up to that 99th percentile, we don't really know all that student knows above the 99th percentile, and that's because this test doesn't measure that knowledge that goes beyond that 99th percentile. So one common thing that I've seen done is actually giving gifted students tests that are above their grade level, and then you can see some more variability. Absent of all of those issues, we should never be using one test score to determine anything. So basically the principal is saying they're doing well in school, we don't need to change anything. We should never be just complacent that students are doing well. We want to make sure that we're challenging them. And in order to determine if we're challenging them, we can't depend on one test score that might not even have the capability to actually demonstrate how much these students know. So I would agree with Mr. Taylor. We definitely want to advocate for students having this opportunity to take these classes earlier. As I mentioned previously, students who are gifted really need to be around their intellectual peers, which may not be the same age. So they need to be around individuals who can carry on conversations about topics that they're interested in. Sometimes if we keep students only with their same age peers, they actually feel more isolated because they feel very misunderstood. So definitely agree with Mr. Taylor in this case study. We need to convince the principal that this is important. I think I would probably, if put in this situation, respond very similarly to what Dustin suggested, and that would be starting with confronting some of these misconceptions, probably talking about myths versus reality, And then one of you mentioned inviting the principal to come into these honors classes, which is an excellent suggestion, and helping him or her see these indicators of gifts and talents that may not be appropriately being met. Another thing I've mentioned to the principal is when kids are bored, they're not good kids. So it's actually really not helpful to have students who are bored in the classroom because they could produce behavioral problems. So it's important that we're serving these gifted students also for their social and their emotional needs. One important thing to notice, as this stands, even if the principal changes his or her mind and says, okay, I will allow these ninth graders to take this AP test or AP class rather, that is really not enough. That is very limited in terms of gifted services. And it's important that you guys notice this because it's only one AP class. And we can be identified as gifted in different content areas. Remember, we talked about this. Several of you mentioned it in your discussion board. You could be identified as gifted in math, but then placed in a gifted English class. That's a problem. That's a lack of alignment. And lack of alignment is something very common we see in gifted education programs. It's a very big problem. So while I agree that Mr. Taylor needs to advocate for these classes, I do want to point out that these classes alone are really not enough to serve these students. Just a couple of pointers in terms of constructing these discussion board posts. Remember, this is a graduate level class, so I am expecting you to be thorough in your responses. A lot of you did not cite your sources. So again, I really need to emphasize that these discussion board posts should not just be your opinions. I need to see that they are referenced from your library content. In order to do that, you need to provide the author's last name and the date that it was published. If you are choosing to use an entire direct quote, which is fine, make sure you give me the page number as well so I know where you got that quote from. The discussion board posts are your primary way to communicate to me that you have read the material, you have discussed things, you have really processed the information. So make sure that you're taking them seriously, and also in your responses as well, that you're being thoughtful in your responses. I would suggest, if you haven't already done so, before our next discussion board assignment, please make sure that you have read the sample discussion posts as well as the sample responses so you can see what I'm looking for. Okay, so enough on discussion board posts. This week we will be doing our first assignment. So what I want you to do is think back to that myth versus reality quiz that you took in our very first week. So the assignment for this week is for you to look back at your answers and reflect on your responses now that you have a little bit more understanding of the literature in gifted education. So if you go into the module assignments folder, there's a clearly labeled assignment for this week called the Myths and Realities Reflection. This is going to challenge you to look first off at your initial responses. So how did you answer? Did you think it was a myth versus a reality? And then to look through the lens of now you've read some literature and we've started a little bit of classwork. So I'm looking for a reflection. It's typically about 2 pages. I'm not strict on page length. Really, in a graduate class, I just want you to be thorough in your response and give me enough detail to make your point. If you can do that in a page, I would be surprised, but if you do it, that's fine. So I would encourage you not to really think about word count or length as much as being really thorough in your responses and making sure you're providing a lot of evidence. So as you can see in Blackboard, in terms of this myths and realities reflection, I'm looking for 3 components. So number 1, tell me which of the answers surprised you the most. So you don't have to discuss all of the questions that you answered incorrectly, but tell me the ones that really surprised you. So explain, I answered this question incorrectly, and I was surprised that this was a reality or a myth because of these reasons. After you explain the ones that surprised you the most, the challenge is to find a common theme among these incorrect responses. It could be that you had a misconception about the characteristics of gifted learners, and that's why you answered maybe 3 of the questions incorrectly. Maybe you had a misconception about programming for gifted students, and that's why you had certain answers incorrect. It doesn't have to be perfect. What I'm trying to get you to do is think, why did I answer these questions incorrectly? Could there be a common theme among all the incorrect answers? If there isn't, that's okay. Just explain why and tell me your reasoning behind all of them. So number 1, which of these surprised you the most? Number two is a common theme amongst those. And lastly, number 3 is asking you, now that we've done this initial week and we've done this initial myths and reality survey, what topic or topics are you most excited to explore throughout the rest of the semester? So make sure you are addressing all 3 of those components. In addition to that, every single assignment you have has a rubric associated, so make sure that you're looking at that rubric before you submit. One component of that rubric does require you to back up what you're saying with evidence. So that means you need to be citing some sources for this. There's not a certain amount of sources that you need in this case. I just need to be able to tell through your writing that you are basing this reflection on the literature. And in order to do that, make sure that you cite anything that you have used appropriately. So just to be clear, your one assignment for this week is the Myths and Realities survey. The Myths and Realities reflection, which was based on the survey. If you go back in Blackboard and review the requirements for that, there are 3 main components. Number 1, you want to make sure that you are discussing which questions you answered incorrectly that mainly surprised you. Number 2, I'm asking you to find a common theme amongst those incorrect answers. And lastly, number 3, after all of that, what topic or topics are you most excited to explore in our class? As always, guys, my door is open. I'd be happy to meet with you or schedule a time if my office hours do not work. I'd like to say thank you for those who have already come by. And hopefully this week has taught you, if anything, I just want you to realize that giftedness is more than it seems, that it's not just about being smart. Gifted students indeed learn differently. They have that high task commitment, that high creativity, and it's the combination of all of those things that makes a child gifted. And no child is gifted in the same way. And that's why it's really important that we align our services to how we have identified the students. I hope you guys have a wonderful week, and I look forward to hearing from you soon.